variant curation expert panels that I'll be going over. I know there are others on the call that were very involved with this project as well. So throughout this presentation, if you have any questions, please just ask. You can also put questions in the chat. This likely will not take the whole hour, so we should have some time at the end as well if you have questions about this particular topic or any other questions as well. So just as an overview, we will be talking today about why summary text is important for variant classification, also reviewing where summary text is used within the VCI and where it's publicly displayed. And then I'll be talking about how this general standardized text document was developed, and then going over the instructions for use and a few examples, and then also talking about the final written summary for variant classification as well. So first of all, I'm sure many of you are aware why summary text is important in variant classification, but this really provides an opportunity for documentation of any evidence that you have collected that has gone into coming to the classification for that variant. And so by using summary evidence, it really provides you with an opportunity to provide clarity and transparency regarding how that variant classification was made, and to communicate all of that information to any reader or user of that information. And also really important is that this summary information, and particularly the final written summary, is required for our FDA-approved ClinGen variant curation process. So it's really important. I think the FDA wanted to make sure that we had full transparency of all of the information that went into variant classifications. So important to have this summary text. So what we've been thinking is that a general standardized template for summary text could be helpful for efficiency, accuracy, and consistency for variant curators who are working within ClinGen variant curation expert panels. So where is summary text used in the VCI? And again, I'm sure that many of you on this call who've used the VCI, of course, are very familiar with this, but just as a summary, of course, there are summary text boxes for each ACMG AMP code within the VCI, which allows you to summarize all of the evidence that went into deciding whether or not that code was met or not met, and also the strength at which that code was used. So any text for these from these summary boxes for which a code is met or not met is displayed in the ClinGen evidence repository, or the eRepo, which is a publicly available website. So just making sure that any information that you put in these text boxes is well written, are typos, and so on. And if folks could please put themselves on mute if you're not on mute. Thank you. There's a little background noise. So this is showing a screenshot of part of the information from the evidence repo for a variant in the GAA gene. So again, just showing all of the different codes that were met or unmet and the summary text that was included there. So this is what is shown publicly in the eRepo. So again, just a reminder to make sure that all of the information there is well written and checked for typos and so on. Also in the VCI, of course, there is an area where you can include your final written summary that goes over all of the different evidence that was used in that variant classification. Of course, this is showing a screenshot from the VCI. You just click on the view summary box, and this will show the final written summary for that particular variant. And also, if the calculated pathogenicity was changed, it gives you an opportunity to say why. So this final written summary is displayed in the eRepo and also in ClinVar. So again, important to be able to summarize that information, do it in a clear way, making sure that you're not using any abbreviations that someone less familiar with this gene or topic might not know. So really just gives you an opportunity to summarize all that evidence in a clear and transparent way. So this is showing a screenshot from the eRepo. So you can see the written summary here that is above the other codes that are met or not met. And then within ClinVar, of course, the written summary for any approved ClinGen expert panels is shown here. So what we thought within our ClinGen variant curation working group was that it might be helpful for us to create a general standardized text document that could be used by variant curation expert panels, particularly groups that are just starting out and are really just looking for a starting point for which to create their standardized text for their particular genes and diseases. So our goal is to generate this general template summary statements for each ACMG AMP code for use in the VCI. And of note, this is really just meant as a guide. It's meant to be helpful to different VCEPs. It's not required for use, but we were just hoping that this could be helpful. So summary statements can be adapted as needed for individual VCEPs and variants. As I mentioned, really just to be used as a guide. Of course, we understand that most of the established VCEPs already have templates for their standardized text. So they certainly shouldn't feel obligated to use this document, but certainly, we're hoping that it could be helpful for different curators and groups. We also wanted to provide a framework for using the summary statements within the VCI to build a final written summary of all evidence. And so basically, the goal was to be able to concatenate or put together all of the different summary statements that were used for met or unmet codes, and then to produce a draft of the written summary that could then be edited as needed for clarity and flow. So within this framework, what we tried to do was also to provide an introductory sentence based on the type of variant, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. But for example, the summary statement that we generated for PVS1 can be used as the first sentence of the final written summary for loss of function variants. And we did similar things for missense variants, in-frame insertions and deletions, and so on. So really the goal was to try and make this as efficient and straightforward as possible, and also to allow, hopefully, for a final automation of this process at some point in the future within the VCI. So how did we go about generating this document then? So a small group of the Variant Curation working group came together, and we obtained summary text from 10 established Variant Curation expert panels. So thank you very much to those expert panels. This was just tremendously helpful to have this information. We then collected and compared the text for each code, and in particular, a thank you to Christine Preston, who had gone through all of the standardized text documents to put that information together. And then we drafted text for each code. We then discussed this as a group and edited the information as needed. And then once the document was put together, there was a final review and different edits by members of the Variant Curation Working Group. And again, thanks to everybody involved in that review process, again, tremendously helpful. So the standardized text for ClinGen Variant Curation Expert Panels, version 1, was released on July 1st of this year. I had sent the document around via the Biocurator Working Group listserv, but it is also available on the ClinGen website. So if you go to clinicalgenome.org, click on curation activities. Under variant pathogenicity, you'll see the training materials link. And then once you click on training materials, you can scroll down to number 8, is some optional items. And this includes the link to the document there. So it's always available to you. If you've lost it within your email or whatever, you can always get to this document via the website. So now just to talk a little bit about how best to use this document. It is a long document. We went through all of the different codes and tried to provide standardized text. But there are various ways that you can get to the codes of interest. One is to go to the table of contents and just click on the link. So for example, if you have a variant for which BA1 is met, you can just click the link in the table of contents and it will take you directly to the standardized text for BA1. Of course, you can also just search the PDF with the text you want as well to try and get to the correct code. So we try to make it as straightforward as possible to find the information that you need. And so this is just showing a screenshot of the type of information available in there. So for example, for the experimental tab, we give a definition of the code based on the ACMG AMP guidelines, any particular notes that we had, and then standardized text for if the code is met, and then for some codes as well, if the code is not met. We didn't do this for all codes, but for some we did. So moving on. For each standardized text statement, you may see square brackets or some X's, and these basically just act as placeholders for you to replace the information that is needed. So as an example, if we have square brackets with disease phenotype, this could be replaced with, for example, infantile onset Pompe disease or whatever you want to put in there that's relevant for your particular disease. Throughout the document, we are encouraging the use of HGNC gene symbols where needed. So again, that would be replaced, of course, by the name of the gene that you're working on. For some, we provide different options. So for example, if you want to say pathogenic or likely pathogenic, we would put both of those in, and then you can just select the relevant option and include that in your statement. And then square brackets were also used where the strength of evidence could vary for a particular code. And then of course you can just put the relevant strength in there. So it really is pretty straightforward, but just wanted to review that. And all of these instructions are also included in the document as well. So as I mentioned, for some codes, we did include a not met statement, but not for all of them. And of course, you can just adapt the information as needed if you have a code that's not met and we haven't provided that information for you. We do also recommend that original sources of information should be referenced wherever possible. So for example, any PMIDs that you've used, ClinVar variation ID and or the SCV, so this submission code for ClinVar, if your expert panel has already submitted a classification for another variant that was used in the classification of the variant that you are working on. And then also the names of any internal lab contributors. So VSEPs may also want to consider standardizing variant nomenclature. So for example, do you want to use a single letter code or the 3-letter amino acid code consistently? Or do you want to use TER or asterisk for premature termination codon? So that's just another suggestion as well, so that everything is consistent within your expert panel. And of course, just a reminder, again, this is within the VCI, but just a reminder that under no circumstances should you be including any protected health information, any PHI within the VCI, because of course, that is not secure, and we certainly don't want that information becoming public. So just as a few examples, I'm not going to go through the entire document because that wouldn't be, much fun, but just to give you a few examples to show how this document can be used. So as an example, to start off with, a pretty straightforward one, I think this was the first set of codes that we worked on actually. So for population data, some of our recommendations are to make sure that you include the version number of Nomad that you're using, or whichever other data source if you're not using Nomad. We suggest that any minor allele frequencies should be presented in a decimal format without the % sign. And one of the reasons for this is the decimal format is how this is presented from Nomad within the VCI, and certainly errors could be made if you are converting to a %. So the recommendation is really just to use it as shown within the VCI from Nomad. And then also optional is to include the number of alleles. So for example, if the variant was found in 1 out of 35,000 alleles, you can include that information as well. And then with any major updates to Nomad, if you are recurating these variants, you can certainly update this information as well. So this is an example for PM2 supporting being met. Just a reminder that the SVI is now recommending use of PM2 at the supporting level rather than the moderate level. There are recommendations on the SVI website regarding this change, but just wanted to mention that. And again, this information is included in the document too. So in black here, I'm showing the template standardized text. So the highest population, minor allele frequency in Nomad, and then it allows you to enter the version number is whatever the allele frequency is. And then optional, you can include the number of alleles and then in whichever population. And then this is lower than the ClinGen name of VSEP threshold, and then whatever that threshold is for PM2 supporting, meeting this criterion. So in blue here, I'm showing how that all translates into a statement that could be included in the VCI. So the highest population, minor allele frequency in Nomad, version 2.1.1 is 0.00005. In this number of alleles in the East Asian population, which is lower than the ClinGen LSD VSEPs threshold of this for PM2 supporting. And this is showing the data that came from Nomad. So very straightforward, but just wanted to show that example. So we noticed for some codes that different VSEPs would have different approaches to how to use a particular code. And we tried to take that into account as well when we were creating the standardized text. So an example of this might be for PP3 for missense changes for in silico evidence. So some VSEPs are using a single tool for PP3, some are using multiple in silico predictors, and some are requiring that a certain number out of a total number of in silico predictors all match. So we did give various options for each of those approaches, just hoping to be as helpful as possible to different expert panels. And then we also provided an appendix of frequently used predictor tools, just so that's available for folks as well, and also to help with providing consistency for naming these tools. Also, just to illustrate that for some variant classifications, you may be using classifications from other variants. So for examples would be PS1, also PM5 and PM3, for example, which is the in-trans code for recessive disorders. And typically, in those situations, you would want your expert panel to have already classified the other variant. So as an example here, for PS1, the same amino acid change as previously established as pathogenic is happening regardless of nucleotide change. So in that situation, you would want your expert panel to have already classified that other variant. And in that situation, you can include the ClinVar SCV, which is the submission number to ClinVar that your expert panel used for that other variant. So just to mention that, so try to include this information if it is possible. Of course, maybe that variant hasn't yet been submitted to ClinVar, but if it is available, just include that SCV as well, so that as much information as possible is available to any user of the data. As I mentioned before, when we have the final written summary, it's nice to have a sort of introductory sentence for that summary. So we tried to incorporate that in different codes as we went through it, so that it could simply be sort of copied and pasted into your final written summary. So as an example, for PVS1, the statements that we have for PVS1 can actually be used as the first sentence of the written summary for that variant. So this is an example where you can use the transcript ID if you wish. It was optional, but this is an example. So this is the NM number for GAA, the cDNA change, the protein change. So this variant in GAA is a frameshift variant predicted to cause a premature stop codon in biologically relevant exon 8 out of 20, leading to nonsense mediated decay in a gene in which loss of function is an established disease mechanism. So this is our PVS1 statement, but can also serve as the first introductory sentence for the final written summary. And we provided other examples of this as well. So for example, I think PM4 for in-frame insertions and deletions. We've provided a statement for missense changes as well, splice site variants, and so on. And these are just some other examples as well in the case segregation tab. So we provided options for using either case counts or case control data for PS4. And then for PM3, I wanted to mention this one as well. I know PM3 is really only relevant to folks who are working on autosomal recessive disorders. I work on a recessive disorder, so this is always kind of at the forefront of my mind. But PM3 is one of the somewhat complicated code because a lot of information could go into it. So this is for detected in trans with a pathogenic variant. So what we tried to include here was the number of individuals that were compound heterozygous for the variant and a path or likely path variant, and how many were confirmed in trans, and what type of testing was used, and then a number of individuals that were homozygous. And you can also have the option to provide the points based on the SVI point system, and of course PMIDs, ClinVar SCVs for those in trans variants, and so on, and then your final strength. So this is an example of 5 patients reported with Pompe disease. 4 were compound heterozygous for the variant, and a variant that's been classified as pathogenic or likely pathogenic by the expert panel. I listed the variants here and gave the number of points. What I typically do for our expert panel is to have this type of statement within the VCI, and then when I copy it into the final written statement, I may take out the number of points and just put the final strength of evidence. but then this statement would be available in the e-repo if anybody wants to see that. We also included some optional statements for if no data is found, because we felt like that can sometimes be helpful just to say that you have looked for information, but nothing was found. So for example, if no functional data was identified, you can just say, to our knowledge, functional assays have not been reported for this variant. Or sometimes if there has been no literature report of the variant, you can say that as well, that there's no reported literature in any individuals with this disorder. So sometimes it's nice to include those statements as well, just to document that you have looked for that type of information. So I think I'll stop here and ask for any questions. It looks like there's one in the chat. Okay, so from Stephanie, thanks so much for setting this up. A question that our group has, do you want us to be putting these summary sentence when each criteria is met in the VCI and in the summary, or can we just put them in the summary paragraph? Yeah, so I would recommend within the VCI, of course, for each code that you're evaluating, you'll be able to choose which strength of evidence you're using for that code. So yes, I would recommend putting them in the summary boxes within the VCI, and then they can also be transferred to the written summary as well. So that would be my recommendation, would be to use them in both places, just so that you have all that information available. And on occasion, I would say, sometimes we put a little bit more detail in the summary text boxes within the VCI, and then maybe, get it down a little for the written summary. It kind of depends on the situation. But yes, I would put them in both places. So thanks for that question. Any other questions before we go over the written summary?
Jenny, this is Deb. So will and I should probably know this, but will the VCI be working on taking statements that you attach to the different evidence codes and creating the evidence summary for you? Because your curators have to then copy paste like twice otherwise.
Yes, and that's a great question. And yes, I think that is the long-term goal, Deb, to make this an automated process. But yeah, you're right. Right now, it's kind of copy and paste from the standardized text, and then copy and paste from each box within the VCI. But yes, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I can say for sure, Deb, that is definitely one of our plans. Like it's on, I think it's in the SP process as well already. But that is longer term, yeah, auto-generating the evidence summaries is a plan.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Okay, so moving on to the final written summary. So as you're aware, this can be reached by, there's a view summary button in the VCI, and of course this will take you to this page, as well as the options for saving as provisional and so on. But I'm just showing just a snapshot of this. So you have your evidence summary here, and then if you needed to change the auto classification as well. So as I mentioned, this is required as part of the FDA's recognition of the ClinGen variant curation process. So as we've just talked about, one option is really just to concatenate or list all the different summary statements from the VCI and kind of put them all together in this final written summary. And then once that's done, you can then edit that statement for clarity and flow. And I think this, the amount of editing you do really depends on how complex the variant was. I mean, if it meets BA1, you may just be able to copy and paste and you're pretty much done. Others obviously are more complicated, especially if there is conflicting evidence. So typically what I do is just copy and paste all the statements and then kind of read through it for flow and just making sure everything sounds okay and edit as needed. But I realize that different expert panels have, different processes for that, before the review. Okay, moving on, here we go. So what we also decided to do was to create a sort of suggested structure for the final summary. And again, this is really just meant as a guide. Certainly you do not have to follow this to the letter. It was really just meant as a suggestion. So certainly to begin with, an introductory sentence can be helpful that sort of introduces the variant. Like, what is the variant? What does it do? What type of variant is it? I already mentioned that we can use the PVS1 statement as the introductory sentence for a final written summary about a loss of function variant. So I'm showing that again here. There were some codes, again, we can use that summary text for that particular code. Again, PM4, I think, was a good example for the in-frame insertions and deletions. For some types of variants, there really wasn't a good code that we could kind of use in that way. So we, in that way, just created our own summary text for that. So for example, for missense changes, you would say C dot, whatever the change is. You can include the transcript if you want. Variant in whichever gene is a missense variant predicted to cause substitution of whatever at amino acid number. Again, example here for GAA is that this particular variant in GAA is a missense variant predicted to cause substitution of arginine by cysteine at amino acid 437, and then giving the P dot. So again, pretty straightforward. So that would be your first sentence. And then after that, you can simply list your standardized text statements by copying and pasting from the individual boxes within the VCI. So we suggest beginning with any relevant case or segregation criteria, the population allele frequency, any experimental evidence, and any variant type evidence such as in silico evidence and so on. And there's more information on this available in the actual document itself. And then, of course, read through it for clarity and flow as well. If there is any conflicting evidence, you should clearly describe what that evidence is, so the pathogenic versus the benign evidence, and whether that conflicting evidence is consistent or inconsistent with the final classification. So as an example, you may have overwhelming evidence that this variant is pathogenic, but perhaps it just didn't meet PP3, it just fell below the Ravel cutoff or something like that. So that's really not inconsistent with the classification, but you would still want to mention that. And of course, if there's enough conflicting evidence, the variant would maybe be described as a VUS. So you could make a statement like that too. There is conflicting evidence of similar weights each way, so this variant remains a variant of unknown significance. So just making sure that you're transparent about how you came to the particular classification. And then at the end, always including a final summary statement, saying that in summary, this variant meets the criteria to be classified as whatever pathogenic, VUS, or whatever, for the inheritance and disorder based on the ACMG AMP criteria applied as specified by the name of the VSEP, and then list the criteria that you applied, such as PVS1, PM3, strong, whatever. So just add the list. Then add the VSEP specifications version, so version 1, version 2, or whatever, and the date of approval of the classification. So this would be for a sort of straightforward one. As I mentioned, if there is conflicting data, you can make a statement about that as well. So for example, although there are both pathogenic and benign types of evidence, whichever evidence is not considered inconsistent with the final classification. So just making that type of statement as well, so people don't have questions about that. And then this is an example. I won't go through all of this, but just showing how you can put all the information together, basically by copying and pasting the statements from the VCI to make this final summary statement. I've included all the PMIDs here. I think this was a pretty, a variant that had actually a ton of information. So yeah, represented 6.8% of alleles in an Italian series of 29 infants. So you can include this type of information as well. If it's a really well-known variant, it's nice just to have that kind of background as well, if there's any sort of review or data like that. Then just going through the different codes, we have PP4 moderate, then PM3, so this is sort of case level data, the allele frequency data, then the in silico data, and then there were no functional studies available that were found, and then our summary statement here. And you'll notice I should have included the version number and final review date, so that would be included here as well. So in summary of our summary text, so this document was really just developed as a guide to facilitate entry of summary statements in the VCI. So again, you know, it's not something that you have to follow to the letter, but please just use it as your VSEP finds helpful. The summary text is then publicly available in the ClinGen e-repo and in ClinVar. So just a reminder to be careful about what you put in there. Definitely no PHI should be included in the VCI under any circumstances, but just making sure that the information you include would be understandable to someone who may not be as familiar with the the disease area and checking for typos and so on. Individual VSEPs can adapt the summary statements as needed to create their own standardized text. For example, I had gone through the general document and adapted everything for our lysosomal storage disorders VSEP for GAA. And so that's something that you all can do as well. Of course, established VSEPs that already have their own standardized text shouldn't feel obligated to use this document, but feel free if it's helpful at all. And as you all start to use this document, please provide us with any feedback. So anything that's working well or anything that's confusing or any typos or anything like that, please let us know so that we can make improvements in the future to make this as useful as possible for everybody. So I just wanted to acknowledge the members of the Variant Curation Working Group for reviewing the draft document and for all the input. And then thank you to all of these different Variant Curation expert panels for providing their summary text to us, because we use this as the basis for generating this general document. We really appreciate that information as well. And then any questions? I think there's a question in the chat. So from Joanna, should the VSEP submit their own standardized text versions to anyone or your group? Are there plans to collect them somewhere? Oh, that's a great question. So at the moment, we don't have any plans to review these standardized text documents. I do believe that as part of the Variant Curation Expert Panel approval process, you have to submit at least a few different written summaries so that the SVI can review them and make sure that they are appropriate. But at the moment, there's no plan to review these actual standardized text versions. But yeah, plan to collect them somewhere. I think that's a great idea, and that's something that we should think about as well, because it might be helpful, for the future if we update this document. So yeah, we'll discuss that as well. Thanks for that suggestion. Any specific recommendations for population frequency tests in cases with a known founder population? Yes, that's that's a great question too. And we don't actually have anything like that in the current document, but we can certainly consider adding something like that. And if anyone has any standardized text for that, that would be good to know. And then, okay,